David Enoch, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
David, you've been thinking about a subject that a lot of people have been thinking about for the last years and that I've been having lots of conversations about on this podcast, which is liberalism. But you have the suspicion that a lot of people, both in your academic discipline and philosophy, and perhaps in the broader public, perhaps politicians, are going around defending liberalism in the wrong way. So perhaps let's start with that. I mean, what are the main ways in which people tend to defend liberalism, and why do you think that those are wrong?
Maybe I'll start with a metaphor that I really like, and it comes from sports, I guess. I mean, football or soccer, depending on which side of the ocean you're on. And I always
I've become a traitor. I've started to say soccer instinctively. I'm ashamed of myself.
The thing I've enjoyed most about coming to Oxford is the ability to say football again. So suppose that you have two teams, and one of them plays to win, and the other one pretends to be the referee. Well, if that's how things go, then first we know who's going to win. And second, how many football fans do you know root for the referee? Right? So I think that many liberals have been playing as if they are the referee, as if liberalism is not about some strongly held, true, justified, if fallible convictions, and then what follows from them politically in a practically wise way. But instead, as if what liberalism is all about is somehow dealing with disagreement in a fair, neutral kind of way. There are different ways of filling in the details in this kind of liberal or pseudo-liberal vision. But I think that this is how the game has been playing out, and I'm not surprised that when this is how the game has been playing out, liberals have not been winning.
So let me push you on this in two ways, right? The first is that you could slightly alter that metaphor, and I remember having some of these debates in the early years of the rise of populism, right, where people also use a sporting metaphor, which is, imagine you're playing football, and your opponent suddenly turns up with baseball bats. What should you do? Should you continue to play football, or should you get the baseball bats out yourself? And I think that's a really tough question, because of course you'd be foolish to continue playing football if your opponents turn up with baseball bats. On the other hand, if you both start clobbering with each other with baseball bats, it's very clear you're no longer playing football. So if your goal is to play football, that's not really helpful either, right? The other way to push on this is just to sort of ask you to clarify what in this context you mean by liberalism, because liberalism itself is in part about rules, right? It is about saying the head of government, the head of state shouldn't have all of the power. We need to have a separation of powers. It is about saying the majority of the population doesn't get to tell you how to worship and how not to worship, what you can say and what you can't say. So, in a way, for liberals, trying to police the rules is part of playing the game. And I do think that there's a legitimate concern among conservatives that if liberals are saying, hey, this is the rules everybody should play by, this is, the right values. And by the way, those involve that you shouldn't be too religious, that you shouldn't have these kind of convictions, that, perhaps you get to go to church once a week, but when you start doing that more than that, then perhaps there's something slightly weird and odd about you, right? Then we're actually breaking what's supposed to be the spirit of the ideology we're defending. So what do you mean by liberalism here in this context? And how do we know that what you're asking us to do isn't to actually give up on the rules that are central to what a liberal society is?
Right. So words are tricky, and histories, including histories of words, are tricky. And liberalism, as you well know, means different things in different contexts, in different locations, in different academic disciplines. So I don't want to argue over the word. I mean, I do think that the kind of thing that I'm going to sketch captures a central part of what the liberal tradition has been about. But if you want to use the word differently, I'll just use another word. The kind of liberalism that I have in mind is first and foremost about a commitment to some underlying values and principles. And those are not going to surprise you. There's going to be something there about the significance of well-being. There's going to be something there about equality, though of course different liberals may understand equality in somewhat different ways. There's going to be something very central about liberty and indeed about the value of autonomy. though again, there may be differences between different liberals about the precise details, and maybe one or two other things, maybe something about the hope for rationality and some kind of universalism. And that's pretty much it. Importantly, this is not yet anything about specific political arrangements or institutions. So it's not even directly about free speech, it's in no way directly about democracy. All of these institutional political arrangements are, as it were, further down the road. And in order to get from the basic underlying principles and values to them, we need to do some argumentative work, and that argumentative work is going to be at least partly, is going to rely at least partly on empirical claims. The questions about institutions are always what kind of institutions best manifest, best express, best promote the underlying values and principles. And importantly, crucially, we liberals do not lose our confidence in the underlying principles and values at the first sight of disagreement. We know what we stand for, these are the things we stand for. And then we ask practical political questions about how best to realize these underlying values and principles in political arrangements and institutions. I do think that across a very wide set of circumstances, what these principles will end up justifying is going to be, at least in broad outline, the kind of liberal institutions that you had in mind. Something about free speech, something about constraints on political power, something about democracy, or, at least in the vicinity of democratic decision-making, something along these lines. But all of these things are further down the road, and they require empirical input. So just to give one example that I think is very clear, from a failure of one of my philosophical heroes. So I think of this kind of liberalism as very, very Millian. It's very much in the spirit of John Stuart Mill. And when John Stuart Mill talks about freedom of expression, without a doubt a central liberal thing for many of us, he really relies on quite doubtable empirical claims, right? In a slogan that he's of course better than this, but in a slogan, it's about how truth is likely to win in an unconstrained competition.
So I disagree with your reading about Mill, and we shouldn't make the conversation about that. But I think there's a kind of naive reading of Mill where he believes in a marketplace of ideas, and the truth is going to win out in the marketplace of ideas, and that's why we should defend free speech. And it seems to me that if you read Chapter 2 of On Liberty carefully, the argument is a little bit more settled than that. He thinks, for example, that in many ages and many times, the untruth may win out. I think he believed that in Victorian England, wrong ideas won out to a very large extent, even though there was significant freedom of speech.
Yes, of course, as I said, slogan version.
Right. But he thought that the one thing that freedom of speech allows is that at least the speech remains rediscoverable. Right, at least it doesn't get completely shut out. But anyway, as a side
but the point I want to make is independent of a specific reading of Mill, obviously, and that's that whether freedom of speech can be justified, and much more interestingly, how exactly it can be justified, in what ways, how to actually translate it to institutional, legal, constitutional constraints, and so on. That's not going to be dictated by the underlying liberal principles alone. For that, you're going to have to know a lot about, how communication actually works in the real world, in a specific time, in a specific place. And this connects to another point that I find is crucially important, and that's also related to the baseball bat example. And that point is that I draw a rather sharp distinction between the underlying values and principles. As I said, we're committed to those, and we don't lose our confidence just because some people are racists or male chauvinists or whatever, right? We don't go for a kind of relativism where we know what we stand for. On the other hand, there's the stage of doing politics, and I'm fully a pragmatist at that stage. So I think at that stage, what you should do is you should be practically and politically wise, and you should get the best liberal deal, as it were, that is available in the circumstances, which means that there is nothing that is beyond compromise. There is nothing such that you say, well, if you're not doing that, you're not even allowed. No, these are the underlying principles. Now you have to deal with the real world. The real world is complicated in all sorts of ways, both because of natural constraints and because of people and their different limitations and problems. And there I'm going to be fully willing to compromise, trying to get the best overall liberal arrangement. What this means is that when some bad guys come wielding baseball bats, I'm going to first be willing to fight. I think that this actually is something that comes up in your work as well. The kind of over peacefulness, as if we've already won and we'll never have to fight for these things again. Right? That's never been justified, and it's clearly not justified today. So if need be, yes, you may need to fight, and if you have to fight people with baseball bats, you may want to find your own baseball bat, of course. But you're going to try to do it in a way, to the extent possible, that is constrained by the principles and values to which you are committed. Those that, in that example, I guess, come from football.
Great. So I want to get into each of these parts, which is both where should we have moral certainty, and when and in what ways should we be willing to compromise given the constraints of a real political world. But before I get there, I guess I still want to understand the premise of where you think people go wrong. And I don't know if you can give an example of a specific politician or a specific thinker or something that helps me get a grasp of this, because I feel like I sort of get the point, but I haven't quite put my finger on.
So I think I have.
Right. So let me just you know, it seems to me that liberals tend to be relatively confident in their beliefs about what a better political system would be. And that perhaps sometimes we can be overly confident in imposing sort of values in, what in philosophy might be called a perfectionist liberal way, in a way of where we're not just saying these are the right rules to bound our society, these are the right terms of our social cooperation, but actually this is what people should be like in society. This is the extent to which we can tell, to cite one controversial legal case in the United States, the deeply Christian baker, that they need to be willing to, individualize a wedding cake for a gay couple, because, if you have prejudices against gay people, you're a bad person, and we're not going to stand for that, right? So where, I guess, in the culture do you see these liberals who aren't willing to defend their convictions at that level of principle, at that level of ideas?
Yeah, so I have three kinds of liberals in mind that I think are the wrong ones. One comes from philosophy departments, one comes from political science departments, and one is in the air. So let me say just a couple of words on each. So from philosophy departments, the kind of liberalism that is now mostly known by the name political liberalism or public reason liberalism, and that's associated with the late Rawls, is often read in this way. Now I should say I've had exchanges with Rawls scholars and so on. There's disagreement about everything, and that's fine, of course, that's how we do our job, that's okay. But at least in the way that Rawls is often read and indeed extremely influential, not just in philosophy, in law schools as well. The kind of liberalism that he promotes is one where there's hardly anything by way of substantive principles and values to which you remain committed, even in the face of strong disagreement. Certainly disagreement with the reasonable, and I guess we could go on and on about what it means to be reasonable, but I suggest that we not do that. So that's one kind of the hyper-neutralist kind of political liberalism that requires that the state, rather than stand for these principles and values, merely talk about what can be a matter of consensus among all of the reasonable.
And what kind? Give me a concrete example. What kind of thing would that kind of Rawlsian political liberal say we should be neutral about? Where you're saying no, we shouldn't be neutral about this. This is something where philosophical liberals rightly have a clear stance.
Right. So suppose that there is some political disagreement, perhaps having to do with the education of children in some community that is hyper-conservative, and that questions of education are extremely hard empirically. But as a matter of principle, right, I would say, for instance, if that education is offends against the student's autonomy, because it's hyper-sexually conservative, or for some other reasons along these lines, then that is something that I don't think the state should be neutral on, just because there is this community that disagrees. And that's still, as I said, I have this two-stage thing of the principles and then the pragmatic, actually political action, right? And the mere fact that you don't lose sight of the fact that autonomy is important and the fact that the autonomy of the children is compromised is a huge tragedy and a moral problem and a matter of political concern. That still doesn't entail that we should now, send in the troops, because that may create more harm than good, or for any other number of reasons that we can talk about later. But I think it's crucial that whatever decision we end up making, even if it ends up being extremely compromising, even if it ends up being a kind of neutralist position, it be motivated by an unwavering commitment to the underlying principles, rather than by some weird hope to remain neutral between truth and falsehood.
So I get the logical structure of this. Just to push you a little bit further, tell me what should be at stake in this kind of issue for you, which is to say, one of the things that make decisions about the education of children complicated, not just empirically but philosophically, I think, is that when you're dealing with adults, liberals have relatively easy answers, right? Adults should be able to make their own decisions. Obviously, there's constraints about when those decisions harm others or other kind of circumstances. We may need laws to constrain them. But basically, the question is, when it comes to questions of sexual morality, you're an adult, you decide, right? With children, the way that I tend to think about it is that we are holding their autonomy in trust, which is to say that they're too young to make certain kinds of decisions. And we want to make sure that they can make their own meaningful decisions later in life. And so it's the joint job in the first instance of the family, but as a kind of backstop of society and the state, to make sure that they get the kind of education, the kind of resources they need in order to lead a self-determined life later on. But that makes it a complicated and special case, right? And so sort of where do you think there are questions, about sexual morality in education, for example, where these, Rawlsian political liberals or perhaps some other people in the culture tend to defer too much, not on pragmatic political grounds, but on principled grounds, to the Amish in some famous American court cases, or to ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities, or to evangelical Christian communities, or whatever it is. I'm assuming you have religious communities in mind that may be at stake here.
Right. So in principle, before we're doing pragmatic politics, we should not be neutral, for instance, between ways of doing sexual education that open up options and that close up options later in life, or ways of doing sexual education that contribute to personal well-being and that actually create serious suffering later on, and ways of sexual education that are consistent with egalitarian understanding of different people in society, compared to ways that are deeply hierarchical in their attitude to sex or in other things as well.
But what I mean, this is all still at the level of abstraction, right? Like, are you saying we shouldn't go like in principle we shouldn't have teachers go in the classroom and say gay people are bad? Because that I agree with, but it's not clear to me how many sort of philosophical liberals don't agree with that. Where does the rubber hit the road? What are the statements where you think liberals are willing to say, oh, I'm kind of neutral about that, and they shouldn't be neutral about that? Because I have in the back of my mind that other people are going to say, well, one of the things that's happening in education in the United States is people going into elementary schools, into middle schools, saying there's no such thing as a gender binary. Right? All of gender is a spectrum. And if you decide as a very young child that you're actually a different gender from what you are, we're going to applaud you for that and talk about your bravery. And perhaps it might mislead children into making wrong decisions about their bodily future at a very young age. So there's going to be people who have worries on the other side, but I don't think are completely easily dismissed either. But
that's a good example. One of the things that are crucial here is that truth matters. So if, in particular, a life of sexual experimentation or sexual freedom, or merely not feeling guilty for doing what sexually comes naturally to you, is, other things being equal, a better life, then we should not be neutral between the kind of education that encourages this and the kind of education that does not. That doesn't yet mean that any old, perhaps too extreme version of, I suspect it's more there in right-wing caricatures of kind of left progressivism, but I'm assuming there are some cases like this that are actually real and so on. That doesn't mean we have to endorse that either, But precisely, we don't have to be neutral between truth and falsehood. So let's see. Is there something genuine there that answers to the real concerns about well-being, or about equality, or about hierarchy, or about autonomy, including sexual autonomy? Or is it something else? And if it's genuinely of value, then we need to take that into account. And you said, where does the rubber hit the road? That's a problem, because the rubber hits the road further down the road. Namely, once we take into account, for instance, all of the constraints on the use of state power, worries about abuse of power, and other things as well. That's where I say, I'm in principle willing to compromise on all of this. But there's a huge difference between saying, look, this is the kind of education that is intrinsically much better because it promotes well-being and sexual autonomy rather than oppress them. Now, is there anything we can do about it? Quite possibly the answer is yes. Probably not sending in the troops, that's a very pricey option, but there are going to be others. And if there is nothing we can do about it, then we shouldn't do anything about it, but we should still recognize the tragedy rather than think about it. It's a kind of happy, let's respect, we should respect and the practices of this community. No, the practices of this community are oppressive and they make people suffer. So that's the initial point. And that doesn't mean we should do things that will make people suffer even more, but it does mean that the starting point has nothing to do with this kind of hyper-neutralism that, again, I'm not sure Rawls is to blame for, but certainly many Rawls inside. So
yeah, and I do think that principle, I think, is one that we can take more generally that's really useful. I think it's very tempting to say, if X is right, we've got to do whatever we can to pursue it. And if we think on pragmatic grounds that we shouldn't pursue it, then the way to deal with it, cognitive dissonance, often becomes to stop claiming that X is right. Whereas in many situations in politics and in life, X is right, you can't fully realize that, you should make a pragmatic assessment about the extent to which you can, but you should live with the discomfort that you have in some ways given up on pursuing what is right, because under the circumstances, that is how best to preserve that value. I mean, in a very different context, I feel like I had a very similar position in some of the debates about impeaching Donald Trump, in which I both felt that he deserved to be impeached, for example, for his actions on January 6th, 2021. But I had the political calculation that it was very unlikely that we would gain the majorities to impeach him. And I thought that it would be much more politically damaging to try and impeach him and fail to do so than to not try to do so. And I think very few people on either side understood my position. I think the people who were in favor of impeachment said, but if it's right, then we have to do it. I said, no, if it's right, what we need to do is to reduce his power in the world. And if going ahead with an impeachment that is perhaps philosophically justified or legally justified is actually going to increase his power, then that's a really bad idea. And on the other hand, I think people who are against impeachment because they might have liked Donald Trump thought, well, Yascha must secretly think that he shouldn't be impeached. So no, I thought he should be impeached, but my pragmatic judgment was it wasn't going to happen, and that meant that the best way to pursue the broader goal of not giving him further power over the American Republic was to not try to pursue a course of action which was likely to fail.
I would imagine
I agree
that the tension you mentioned is really basics. It's like politics 101, right? I would imagine that any good, wise, conscientious politician deals with that tension every day, no?
And then they're pushed by their allies and their donors and by social media into doing what sometimes they know is not very wise. But that is.
I never said it was an easy job to do.
So speaking of politics 101 and the people who sometimes fail it, I think you said the first bucket of people who get this wrong are philosophers, and the second are political scientists. What do political scientists get wrong?
So there's this thing called political realism, which is, I think, fairly, I mean, you'll know this, of course, better than I do, I think is gaining grounds and considered rather popular among political theorists in political science departments. I don't think it's gained any grounds in philosophy departments, which is in itself interesting. Now, it's hard to state what the view is, and I don't know that I understand it well enough, and I'm not sure that I plan to change that considerably, but that view often introduces itself as in a kind of contrast with what they call political moralism. And they think that that politics is not about morality at all, that moral normativity or moral values or moral principles should not play a guiding role in how we do politics. And I think that that's both confused intellectually and problematic politically. Now, somehow they think that they still maintain a normative edge that allows them, say, to criticize what's going on politically, despite this starting point. They sometimes talk about a sui generis political kind of normativity. I can say these words, it doesn't mean that I know exactly what it means. And some political realists also think of themselves as liberals. But I want to make it very clear that that's not the kind of liberalism I talk about. The kind of liberalism I care about, and that everyone should care about, very much starts from moral commitments. It doesn't go too quickly from moral commitments to political action precisely because of the tension we just discussed. So it's quite possible that you're committed to these things, but that doesn't mean you have to immediately follow through politically in the most simple, straightforward kind of way. And perhaps this is all some political realists mean, in which case I'm happy to have them on board. But yes, politics, the normative parts of political philosophy are an important particular instance of sophisticated, practically implemented moral philosophy. So that's for the political realists.
I have a friend who's an actress, and I remember many years ago her recording an ad that was somehow supposed to have a mid-Atlantic accent, and there was a British director and an American director on the project, and the American director kept saying, "You just sound British," and the British director kept saying, "You just sound American," and she ended up despairing. Political theorists are a little bit like that, and I say this as somebody who has a PhD in political theory, but political scientists definitely consider us sort of weird pseudo-philosophers, and the philosophers consider us weird pseudo-political scientists.
Yeah,
I think the political scientists in the audience are going to object to you describing this as a political science view, but that's fine. We'll leave them to object.
Well, I said it's a part of political science department.
Right. And that they would acknowledge grudgingly is to some extent still the case. We're trying to change it. What are the stakes here? I mean, going beyond those obscure political debates, you might say that this is a larger kind of temptation in politics that perhaps comes not just out of a somewhat simplistic lay reading of Machiavelli, but out of a smarter reading of Machiavelli, right? There's the famous line in I believe, The Prince, where he says, in politics, perhaps it's in the discourses, where he says, it is bad. Sometimes in politics it's bad to be wholly good. Sometimes in politics it's bad to do something halfway. You should either be wholly good or wholly bad. And the idea here is that there are certain kinds of moralizing in politics that both constrain how you're going to act and ultimately are just going to lead to disaster. That politics is this
I
kind
agree
of
with
sphere.
that.
Right. So what is the kind of political realist view that you worry about, where you are saying, hang on a second, now you're just giving up on principles in politics in a way that sounds pseudo-profound, but actually it's going to lead you down the wrong way? And how is that different from a kind of political pragmatism that I think you do advocate, once the rubber hits the road and you're trying to figure out how you can best further moral values?
Right. Good. So I think that some of the things that people find attractive about this kind of political realism and about Machiavelli are things like the following. In our normal kind of private life, it's very often wrong to lie. But you may think that sometimes for politicians it's okay to lie, and maybe more often than it is in our private lives. And I think that that's true. I think that politicians too shouldn't lie without sufficient justification. But in politics, the stakes are very high, and it's going to be more often than in our normal lives justifiable to lie. And some people think, okay, so you're already not a moralist in the sense you don't think that the same morality applies in politics as it does to our private lives. And I don't think it shows that I have any problem with applying morality in politics. It just shows that what follows from morality is hypersensitive to circumstances. For instance, to how high the stakes are. So if that's all you mean by a kind of divorce between politics and morality, I'm fine with that. But it's a divorce. It's a very like a second stage divorce dictated by the principles of morality themselves. So I don't have a problem with that. Where I do have a problem is where, and again, I don't want to generalize, and I don't know, I've read only parts of this literature, but where some political realists will want to insist that nothing in politics is morally criticizable. That somehow, if you try to criticize political practices or political actions in moral terms, you are already committing a category mistake. It's as if you are playing soccer and declaring something a ball or a strike, right? To return to our previous example. That, I think, is unfounded intellectually, but also extremely unattractive politically. Because we do think that the main problem with many political practices is, at the end of the day, a moral problem. And we do want to give a good account of how it is problematic, perhaps a good account of what better institutions, arrangements, political actions we can hope for. And these are all we're going to be using everything that is at our moral disposal in doing all of that. So I think that if, to the extent that political realists want to prevent, to sort of deprive us of those resources, that makes us that weakens the good guys on the political, in the political sphere.
Great, very helpful. So I know we're still in preambles here, but what is it in the general kind of vibe you were saying that liberals also sometimes get wrong, where they also lose the courage or the convictions that they should hold on to?
Right. So I want to give an example that somehow stuck in my mind, although it's from, 20-something years ago. I think it was during the first rise to power of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and there were I was a PhD student at the time. I remember there were starting to be petitions online, specifically about the way that the Taliban treated women. Unbelievably, perhaps, we're almost at the same point again now, right? And then there were these petitions, and there started to be, from the left, these counter responses to these petitions. And they said something like, but this is Western imperialism, it's a different kind of culture, something along, don't judge kind of thing, it's not for us to say. And that I found was terrible. It was terrible because I don't think that these arguments work intellectually, philosophically, regardless of politics. And we can talk about this a little bit more if you want. But it was also clearly, politically, to say it was weakening is an understatement, right? It was a way of preventing the good guys from mastering the political will to do something about a horrible thing that was going on. And of course, it's extremely asymmetrical. The bad guys don't care about this stuff, right? So this kind of really confused, perhaps relativism, perhaps skepticism, perhaps nihilism, perhaps the weirdest, widest kind of pluralism, as if all ways of lives are equally good or something like that, that never weakens the bad guys, but it always weakens the good guys. And I think that it can be shown actually quite easily that intellectually this does not hold water. And then it can also be shown, expected quite obviously, to be politically damaging. To the extent that someone thinks that liberalism is about not judging other ways of life, or that liberalism is about refusing to say that some moral claims are true and some false, or that some actions constitute a wrong, indeed a grievous one, right? To the extent, and that I don't think that many philosophers or political theorists do that, but I do think it's very much in the air. And it's again this kind of unwillingness to distinguish between truth and falsehood, and that I think it's really important to sort of expose both the indefensibility intellectually, but also how harmful it can be, politically.
That is really interesting, and it connects to one of the strands of work that you're most known for in philosophy. Within meta-ethics, and some of those discussions are going to get too abstract for this podcast pretty quickly, but I would like to double-click on this topic. It seems to me always that there's some kind of weird misunderstanding of your own position within that kind of line, where people are saying, it would be wrong for me to judge the Taliban on their way of life, but that presumes that there's some kind of standpoint by which you are going to be objectively wrong in doing that, which is kind of a strangely self-undermining position. Perhaps I can help to explain what I mean by that with an analogy. In some debates about free will, and we've had some of those debates on the podcast here, there's this idea that if free will doesn't exist, then it's really wrong to punish people for crimes, and therefore, the philosophical debate over free will sort of should determine whether or not we have prisons and stuff like that. And I think there's like a million steps in between that philosophical premise and that empirical conclusion that people kind of skip over. But what's interesting to me about this is that what drives a lot of the anxiety about this for people seems to be, and if I'm complicit in locking these people up who can't actually be guilty because they don't have free will, then I'm guilty of some terrible misstep. And but if you really believe that there's no free will and that those kind of moral categories are misplaced, then you shouldn't worry about your own guilt or innocence in being complicit in this set of social affairs. So again, you kind of misunderstand. You're pretending. You're not applying this moral standard to others, while in a weird way still holding yourself to those same moral standards. Which of course means that even for you saying, that it's colonialist to think that women should have basic rights in Afghanistan, you in a strangely colonial way are saying, well, these moral standards apply to me, but those kind of primitive people over there, it would be wrong to apply those moral standards to them, which is quite ironic. So tell us, you're much more philosophically sophisticated about this than I am, why is that kind of moral relativism that is implicit in this stance of, who are we to judge a community for forcing its women to wear a burqa, for forcing its women to marry the person who's chosen by their parents, etc., etc. What is philosophically wrong about that position?
Well, happily, more than one thing. The point that you mentioned is, of course, crucial. When I teach this kind of stuff, I like to present a kind of argument that says something like, there are no objectively true judgments about what's right and wrong. Therefore, it's wrong to condemn these practices in another society. And I show how not only isn't this argument sound, so the premise does not actually establish the conclusion, but the premise actually establishes the negation of the conclusion. Right? If there are no objectives, then that judgment in itself cannot be true, and that is like the worst possible flaw an argument can have. But that doesn't yet show that the view is false. It shows that at least one way of arguing for it fails. But there are other things too. So one common set of fallacies in the neighborhood here has to do with the role of disagreement. So it's a really important question to ask: how, if at all, does disagreement about, say, moral judgments or about values, how does it shape our meta-ethical commitment, our commitments about, say, the objectivity of morality and so on? And there's this kind of, perhaps an initial suspicion that if there's disagreement, there's no objective truth. Or perhaps if there's disagreement of some specific kind that satisfies some further conditions, then there can be no objective truth. And here I think that this by and large fails, but that the way forward here is to do piecemeal analysis of specific arguments. So what kind of disagreement do you think is relevant in what way, and let's see. But anyway, if you go for the full scale, wherever there's disagreement, there's no objective truth, then we can easily come up with counterexamples from morality as elsewhere. But also we can again present a kind of self-undermining, self-defeat point, right? Because that statement itself, the one that if there's disagreement, there's no objective truth, that statement itself is controversial. So it would undermine its own truth and so on. But there is
so help my listeners think through this, right? Because I do think that there is a caricatured version of this moral relativism that immediately triggers me, gets my hackles up, right? I mean, the idea that it's just the choice of this community how to live. The most philosophically liberal way to formulate my objection to this is to say, I believe that people should have a right to live in dignity and freedom and self-determination, and that means that they can make a lot of choices about how to live. If an adult chooses to make a very extreme religious choice, whether that is to become a certain kind of very self-abnegating nun who's not going to speak to anybody outside of a convent for the rest of her life, or to wear a burqa or whatever, we might need to tolerate that choice, even if we're a little bit concerned about how much it really serves the well-being of that person. But if the community imposes that choice on that individual, then there's a very straightforward objection, where we did not choose that, and we believe that human beings should be able to choose how they live on some basic dimensions. But at the same time, so I think there is a very strong argument against this, but at the same time there is, I think, a more understandable concern that historically we've often gone around and said, we know what's better for the people of India, and so we're just going to rule over them and tell them how to live, right? We may not understand the details of this community, but we're going to go in and say, we have all of the wisdom, and we're going to tell you how to have a lovely, thriving society, and that has gone pretty wrong. So how do we think about not being morally relativist in those ways, recognizing that there are some deeper truths that may be universal, but also paying attention to the ways in which that really might be perverted into a kind of colonialist attitude, into the idea that an unserem Wesen soll die Welt genesen, on our culture and moral enlightenment, the world shall become better, when historically that has often led us astray.
I certainly share the worry, and I'm not a bigger fan of the history here than you or any other decent person is. But I don't think there's a kind of one-size-fits-all answer to this. What we have to do is to try really hard to avoid this, to listen to other people, although they may be mistaken as well. We need to be epistemically modest. This is something that I think is crucial. That is, we have to realize that there are many things we don't know. Perhaps you just don't know, coming where you're coming from, what exactly it's like to wear a burqa. And you may want to try and find out, which will have to involve also listening to people who do, but also doing that with a kind of willingness to find out that some of them may be mistaken about this as well. So this kind of epistemic modesty is crucial for me. Notice, by the way, that epistemic modesty is crucially different from relativism, right? So the relativist, nihilist, whatever, presupposes something like that there is no objective truth. If you're going to be epistemically modest, you have to presuppose that there is an objective truth. That's precisely why you have to be modest, because it's not easy to actually find out what that objective truth is. So of course you have to be epistemically modest. You have to be instrumentally wise. This is crucial, right? So think about, the toppling of the Saddam regime. If somebody wanted to criticize that by talking about Saddam's rights and privileges as sovereign, then I have zero interest in having that conversation with them, right? But on the other hand, if someone said, well, of course Saddam does not merit any kind of protection, but have you given any thought to what things are going to be like once that regime is toppled? Have you worked sufficiently well on suitable, workable, feasible alternatives and so on? Well, I don't know how much lives have improved in Iraq following, right? I'm assuming that some have and some have not. So yes, we have to be, I think that the two main constraints are being extremely epistemically modest and being instrumentally wise. But I don't know of any way of, I can't sort of put like 3 Newtonian laws about how to be epistemically modest and instrumentally wise across all circumstances. And we just have to try hard on this, to learn from the dangers that we know that have been realized in history, but all the while not to lose sight of the most important universal moral truths there. So I have a paper that I wrote many years ago defending an initial version of this kind of objectivity of morality, and I think I called it something like, why I'm an objectivist about morality, and then in brackets, and why you are too. So I think that, I don't think that many people really don't believe in the objectivity of morality. Many people don't believe that they believe in the objectivity of morality. And I think, it's one of my tasks to try and rid people of this terrible confusion, at least when it comes to politics, where, once again, it systematically weakens the good guys.
Yeah, and it's sort of, there's the old joke by Tom Lehrer, which goes something like, I think that everybody should be nice to each other, and some people don't love their fellow human beings, and I hate people like that.
I didn't know that. It's excellent. Yeah.
It's a very good line, and I think there's something similar here, right? Like where we really don't know what's true in politics, and we should just let people, live as they do, and if some community, in another part of the world is, terribly oppressing its women, that's their right. And anybody who disagrees is a terrible human being, right? And again, as you're saying, that is kind of this most simplistic form of this view, but that is, I think, the form of view that I encounter even with very smart undergrads, even in the public debate.
Right, exactly. So that is deeply troubling. So when you're doing metaethics, these are the more abstract parts of this kind of discussion that you alluded to earlier. There are, of course, more sophisticated versions of relativism or views that are, in the same kind of, that try to answer to the same underlying philosophical concerns. And some of those are quite sophisticated. They certainly avoid the worst problems, and they have to be discussed in the way we discuss them in philosophy. Namely, no slogans, don't accuse them of weakening the good guys, address their arguments, and all of that's fine. But the kind of relativism, skepticism, nihilism, something unclear along these lines, that is actually in the air, and that comes up in political discussions, is the kind of view that no serious metaethicist defends, and for good reason. So that also means that even though I have a specific hyper-realist objectivist view in metaethics, I don't need to rely on all of the details, the absolute details of that view and my arguments for it in order to reject the kind of, as I said, bad liberalism that's in the air. For that, what you need to do is to reject some of the most simple-minded versions of this kind of relativism that are nonetheless extremely influential, at least as part of some kinds of public discourse.
Amazing. Okay, so let's look back to the red thread of the argument. So what you've shown so far is that there are certain ways that people are reluctant to insist on the values and perhaps on objective truths in the political system. And I think something like this example of the Taliban is very clear and striking in this regard. And that is a mistake, that liberals should actually, at least in the first step, be willing, without too much humming and hawing, to insist on their values. What is the form that this liberalism takes? What is the content of that liberalism that we should believe to be objectively true in this kind of way?
I'm not sure I fully understand what you refer to by the word form here. You could ask, what follows to politics? Either the most general kind of politics, so like basic constitutional arrangements, what follows for those? Or you could ask something much more specific, like, well, if you're right, how should we think of campaign financing? Or how should we think about some constraints on state power, and so on? And my answer to these are going to be, to both of these actually, but especially to the second, are going to be somewhat disappointing, because really from that kind of liberalism alone, nothing yet follows. Because everything else is up for, at least to an extent, up for empirical grabs. So, does like a fairly robust principle of free speech follow? I suspect that at least across many circumstances, yes, but not across all. You can certainly cook up kind of philosophically favorite, weird, hypothetical examples where nothing like that would follow. But perhaps more importantly, how much regulation, by whom, of what kind, will strongly depend on empirical considerations. For instance, something that you've addressed in your work, you may think that the presence of social media, or the presence of the internet, or the presence of some specific features of social media means that we should think about speech in a somewhat different way than we used to. Or maybe it just shows that we've always been mistaken, or maybe it doesn't show that we've been mistaken, but it shows that from the same underlying principle, the set of regulations on speech that may be justified now are different. I'm not even sure whether they're more or less than we were used to. They may just be different, like along some other dimension. And similarly for pretty much everything else. So in my most pessimistic moments, I think Mill has gotten a lot of heat for thinking that some nations and peoples are not yet mature and ready for government by representatives, and that's presented as racist and may very well have been. But I sometimes think that perhaps Mill's mistake was that he thought that some of us are sufficiently mature for that. I mean, that is also an empirical hypothesis. It would be deeply depressing if we thought that the negative results follow, but that's still a possibility. So I think that the specific constitutional arrangements, I suspect, would be roughly in line with what we've become accustomed to think of as liberalism. But whether this is so, and much more importantly, the precise details of how this is so, are going to be dictated by those principles, together with a clear-eyed view of the empirical fact and a willing to compromise on everything, as long as it gets you more from that set of underlying principles and values.
How does this agree with or contrast with the following view? Sometimes in grad school, when I read too many abstract philosophical papers about the value of democracy, for example, I started
There's
to
no
feel...
such thing as too much abstract philosophy.
I started to think that whole line of inquiry is somewhat barking up the wrong tree, but we're trying to find these very, very abstract justifications for a set of very concrete institutions whose justification is actually rather different. Why is it that we believe in the separation of powers? Why is it that we believe in certain basic constitutional rights for people? Why is it that we believe in the kind of strange practice of voting every 4 or so years for one of 3 or 4 choices, in some countries effectively 2 choices? Having those people deliberate about stuff, and they make some kind of decision, and then it somehow is supposed to be the case that I'm the author of those decisions because I made like a random choice between 2 options every 4 years, right? And I think a lot of the answer to that is extremely empirical. Most societies in the history of the world have been pretty damn bad, very brutal to any dissenters, not capable of making much economic and material progress. And we stumbled upon a set of institutions that seem to be doing a lot better on those things, that seem to, and this is not a purely utilitarian view, right? It's not just that they're sort of, maximizing the money in your bank account or maximizing the amount of pleasure you feel, because you can go to omakase dinner. It's that they actually happen to serve some things that we care about. They happen to be the set of institutional arrangements that allow people to lead thriving lives, and that's a fundamental justification for why we should have a separation of powers of the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive, which is a kind of strange arrangement. It feels natural to us, but does not feel natural to some of the people coming up with that. You go back to John Locke; he has different divisions of separation of powers because it really hadn't been set in stone yet. But it's not that there's some abstract philosophical reason why we should have a separation of power in general, or the particular separation of powers between these kind of 3 branches of government. It's that from historical experience, we know that is much more likely than any alternatives we have so far concocted to actually give people a meaningful, self-determining life in conditions of relative affluence, and that's what we care about.
So I think that is my view at the end of the day about democracy. But I do want to introduce at least one kind of nuance there. And I'm going to go abstract on you here.
You have my permission.
So imagine a regime, a political order that is actually doing pretty well, perhaps as well as your best kind of democracy, on whatever scales you want, but in which there is a benevolent dictator who calls the shots. I sometimes give the example of Singapore as a perhaps possible example or close example along these lines, right? Now you may suppose that it's extremely good, right? Suppose that people just live much better lives there. Well, in that case, maybe you'd be willing to compromise on your precious little democratic stuff. I'm okay with that, I think. But here's where things go abstract, right? Is there anything missing there in this kind of hypothetical example, right? So you want to talk human rights? Western democracies have a problematic record when it comes to human rights, but by and large better than others. Sure. Let's suppose that in this hypothetical example of mine, human rights are actually respected a little bit more than in your favorite example of Western democracy, liberal democracy. Suppose we then talk about well-being, about prospering in other ways, about equality, about, I really think that along many of these lines, Singapore at least used to be a very good example, but maybe not, or the real world is complicated.
I think one famous political philosopher, kept citing an idealized version of Sweden, and he called it Swedland. So, to distinguish it from the empirically existing Sweden. So perhaps we can call this not Singapore, but Singaland.
Exactly. Let's call it this way. I'm immune to factual counterexamples. So anyway, and this is where I think that some of the philosophers that you now said were doing too abstract work get it right, is that I feel that something is missing in Singaland, right? Maybe it's something about the hope of self-rule. And maybe we should just recognize that that hope has just no chance in hell in anything like a modern state, so we should give up on it. Okay, but something is missing, and it's worth thinking about what exactly it is, right? Or maybe there's a kind of violation of equality that's really important. I mean, why should that guy have so much power and the rest of us should have none or hardly? Again, maybe at the end of the day we should think that it's not important, this kind of equality, or that it is important hypothetically, but it can't be attained in any real life state. Or maybe we should think that it is somewhat important, but it's much less important than some of the other things that can be achieved. Obviously, many people have actually immigrated from Western democracies to Singapore. Right? So maybe that shows that at least for many people that all the benefits were more important. But as long as you agree with me that something is missing, normatively speaking, something is missing there that's not missing in your best example of a liberal democracy, then we can talk about that. What exactly is missing there, and whether it's worth the relevant prices. I think that you're right that in the real world, I mean, if you ask political scientists or historians for examples along these lines, I think Singapore is going to come up quite a lot, partly because there aren't that many examples, right? So it's not coincidence. And then I agree, there's this quote, I'm going to get it partly wrong now, that I like from Judith Shklar, where she says, about the relation between liberalism and democracy, she says something like that they are eternally, monogamously married, but it's a marriage of convenience. Right? So that's the kind of, it gives the kind of view that I have in mind here. What is of ultimate importance are liberal fundamental values and principles. Democracy is further down the road and very much vulnerable to empirical stuff of what follows from these principles to the specific circumstances. But I suspect that in most cases, at least in the world roughly as we know it now, this is roughly speaking going to be the kind of system of government that liberal fundamentals call for.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have two thoughts on this. The first is that I do think self-determination matters as a political value. I think democracies are vulnerable on that because most people empirically don't feel that they're engaged in a lot of self-determination.
Wait, is the problem that they don't feel that, or that they don't have self-determination?
Well, that's going to be the second point, and that often, I mean, there's another view that I hold myself, for example, necessarily, but majorities of the population in most democracies in Western Europe in particular, and in many other continents as well, have for a very long time wanted to have less migration, and certainly less illegal migration. And the political class has, for various reasons, in part because it's really hard to actually enforce borders well, ignored their preferences. And so I think a lot of people have some objective reason to believe you're not actually listening to what we want on some very important and core things. So that makes democracies a little bit vulnerable on their claim of being able to serve that value of self-determination very well. But the second point I want to make is that somebody who wants to give that empirical argument for democracy a run for their money would say, look, yes, of course, Singapore is in fact a very impressive society. It has some genuine problems with it, but it is a very, very impressive place with a very impressive class of civil servants and who are quite public-spirited. But this is a huge outlier. And, the very, very specific circumstances that make it bad, including, a very impressive founder and all of those things. By and large, there's still very strong empirical arguments for embracing democratic institutions, because the average democratic institution is going to be better able to serve those values. Right? If you were able to export the model of Singapore to lots of places around the world that are on the lower end of performance of democracies, that would be good. I mean, if we can turn, Nigeria into a state that is as affluent, as thriving as Singapore, but give up on some of the democratic freedoms there, that is not a trivial moral choice at all. Perhaps I'd have to think about it, but perhaps I'd be in favor of turning into Singapore. But that's not what's going to happen if the actual existing political elites in Nigeria got all of the powers that the political elites in Singapore have. That's just not a realistic vision of what would happen.
I agree with all of that, of course.
I want to go back to some of those questions of political pragmatism. So we have our set of values that we believe to be empirically grounded and morally correct. And we should be more self-confident in those. We should say these are the institutions that tend to produce the most human thriving. We are able to condemn the kind of oppression of women that happens, in a country ruled by the Taliban or similar groups. And now we face a situation in which we have real empirical obstacles, in which some group within our country really disagrees with us profoundly, in which we fear that pushing too aggressively for gay rights, let's say, in some society that is deeply homophobic, may in fact have backfire. There's some arguments that claim, it's hard for me to assess the empirics of this, that Western funding for NGOs in some African nations is actually what indirectly led to the introduction of the death penalty and other things for gay people there, because there's a kind of backlash against those attempts to fight for rights I certainly very much personally believe in. Right? How do we bring to bear pragmatic considerations under those circumstances without running the danger of giving up too easily, of just saying we're never actually going to fight for those values because we can always cite some pragmatic reason not to? How do we get the balance right here?
There is this danger. It's extremely important to recognize both dangers, right? So one danger is precisely the one you mentioned. It's kind of lack of resolve and also lack of effectiveness, right? But the other worry, the other danger, is to be unwise in ways that are counterproductive. And it's interesting that you mentioned backlash, because that's the kind of example I always give. I am deeply afraid. I have been long before it was popular. I've been deeply afraid of backlashes. And what the risk of backlashes means is that sometimes a politically wise liberal leader will have to give up on what are genuine improvements. So it's not just because something is not going to be feasible. Suppose something is feasible, but suppose it raises the risk of a backlash. Then maybe you shouldn't pursue it, even if you can win. Right? I mean, this is really painful, because it means giving up on important wins. And this is not a win, for my party or for me personally. It's a win in terms of the basic fundamentals, of the liberal fundamentals, right? So yes, you need to somehow get the balance right. You have to be very well empirically informed about the relevant populations and whether a backlash is coming and in what ways and how dangerous it is. But once again, the kind of balancing act that a wise politician will have to go for, or leader, not necessarily politician, will have to go for, will strongly depend on the circumstances. And I'm kind of a particularist about this. I don't think there's a universal principle you can cite here. There's an attitude that I go for. The attitude is being shamelessly uncompromising about the fundamentals and being shamelessly pragmatic and willing to compromise on specific things. But you are right that when it comes to the danger of backlash, there are huge dangers on either side, and what you should do is try to make the decision that is best in those circumstances. And sometimes you may be justifiably risk averse in some ways, and sometimes less so. There may also be, now importantly for politics, less for the philosophical side, there may also be important divisions of labor. So within, say, a feminist movement, there may be room for those who forge ahead without paying enough attention to risks of backlash. And then there may be room for some pragmatist leaders who actually do take that into account, giving up on important feminist wins from time to time, because you foresee the kind of male chauvinist backlash that will get the bad guys back in power.
That's an interesting point about the kind of separation of labor. I think a lot of the problems we run into is when people don't have a sensible conception of their own role or misrepresent what the role is. I mean, to take one random example, there's a big debate about National Public Radio, NPR, in the United States, which, is a bit of a misnomer because it actually only has a very small percentage of its funding from the federal government. I have my misgivings about NPR in certain ways. There's also things that I like very much about NPR. I think the fundamental problem with NPR is not that it's a progressive radio station. It's that it's a progressive radio station that pretends to be a politically neutral radio station. And what NPR should do is to cut the federal funding and say, we are a progressive radio station, right? There's nothing wrong with The Nation as a magazine, since it's a privately owned magazine that openly says, we are a progressive publication. That's a good addition to the public ecosystem. I disagree with The Nation plenty of times, but there's nothing wrong with the existence of The Nation. In fact, it's a good thing that The Nation exists, right? In the same way, I think NPR can have a great role to play in American life if it didn't claim, I believe falsely, to be this politically neutral, public institution in a way that sort of misrepresents what its role actually is.
Well, I don't know enough about that case, to go into it.
Yeah, no, of course, I didn't mean to suggest you need to. Here's one worry I have about your position, and I don't know if that's a pragmatic political worry or whether it is also a philosophical worry, but I think since we're sort of on the pragmatic end of the discussion, it should matter to you either way, which is that one way of making compromises with groups in your society is to say, dear Amish, you have a very different conception of life than we do. We live in a country where we respect that people can have fundamentally different conceptions of the world. This means that we're going to go very far in trying to accommodate you. We may not be able to accommodate you on everything. Perhaps you can take your children out of education. I believe around the age of 13 or 14 is what the Supreme Court ultimately decided. But you're not able to do it at 8, right? Then we would intervene and force them to go to school. So there's going to be some form of compromise here. But part of this is that we don't have a deep view about the ultimate moral truth of religion. Part of this is that we recognize that though we have our own beliefs, you may be right about your beliefs and what is a godly life and what is a worthwhile life. And that seems to me like an attitude of mutual respect in certain ways, right? It sounds to me like the kind of framework that you suggest would be somewhat tougher or meaner in how you address that group, right? At least if you're being honest in your reasoning when you're addressing those groups, you would say something like, we think you're objectively wrong, right? You're wrong about what education is required in order to give children a thriving life. You are wrong in how you think about the world. Now, we know that for all kinds of pragmatic political reasons, it might be a bad idea to send in the troops and crush you, but therefore we're going to come to this deal with you. But make no mistake, we don't really respect you. We don't. You can see how that actually may itself be much less conducive on pragmatic grounds to a good political settlement where we're able to live in peace with each other as citizens of the same country.
Okay, so I want to make 3 points. One on pluralism, one on epistemic modesty, and one on respect. So first, I think earlier I used the word pluralism as I mentioned a kind of radical pluralism where all forms of life are just as good as any other one. And I expressed some criticism of that alongside the criticism of relativism, nihilism, and so on. But there are more restricted versions of pluralism that I think make perfect sense. So I don't think that there's a single way of life that is best. And furthermore, it's mine. Right? I think that there are many ways of life that are equally or roughly equally as good. Perhaps there are some ways of life that are not the best, but that doesn't mean that they don't have at least some very good parts. In fact, perhaps some values that are manifested in those ways of life that cannot be manifested in ways of life that are overall better, right? So I can recognize that. I think that once we are clear on the availability for the liberal of a restricted version of liberalism, it takes at least some of your worry away. I mean, I don't want to say it takes all of it. But, so that's the first point. The second is, let me remind you about epistemic modesty. So you should be, while, as I said, it's not as if every case of disagreement should make you think that, you can no longer object to racism or something. But you should be very open to the possibility that there are some values that you miss. Joseph Raz talks somewhere about, I think he calls it competitive pluralism. That's a kind of pluralism that, there's the value, there may be, your way of life may be very good, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't miss on some important values that can only be realized in a very different way of life, right? So we should be open to that, but it's possible that there's a kind of community that's available to an Amish or some other conservative community that's no longer available to me. And that may be of value, and it doesn't begin to justify sexual oppression or gender discrimination, but that is of value, and that is important. So I think that once we are clear on the epistemic modesty, on the willingness to learn and to find out that perhaps you've been mistaken, I think that also serves to deal, at least to an extent, with your worry. But I also want to mention a doubt about the notion of respect. So how does one respect someone one disagrees with? The kind of view that you express, I think the kind of view that Rawls is often taken to express, is that the way you show respect to someone you disagree with is by disengaging, by retreating to neutral grounds. And I do think that's sometimes a way of showing respect. But I also want to note that often it's a way of showing contempt. Often the way in which you treat someone with respect when you disagree with them is by engaging them. Think interpersonal relations. Right? If someone puts forward a view that I really object to, and I just say, whatever, let's continue the conversation on something else. That's not a way of showing respect. That's a way of saying roughly, you're not worth it for me to correct your mistake. Now, I think Rawls is often associated with the first kind of showing respect. Raz, in important contributions criticizing Rawls, insists on the latter kind of respect. And I'm a kind of in this case, a compromising kind of guy. So I think that respect comes to different things in different contexts. And that sometimes the way you show respect is precisely by retreating to neutral grounds. But sometimes the way to show respect is engaging. And I think it's really complicated. So just saying something like, you have your ways, I have my ways, let's go on. I don't think that we can just in a simple kind of straightforward way say, that's how you show respect and everything else falls short. I think that that's a way of showing respect some of the time, and some of the time other things fall short. But some of the time that falls short, and the way to show respect is very different.
I know that you
mentioned that on top of all of this, there's also the fact that when there are, say, oppressive practices that are part of a community, we can talk about respecting the community or the members of the community who are very much committed to those values. But there are always also victims to be protected. And that's not something the liberal can ignore, at least on the principle level. Whether we should send in the troops is, as we've now said several times, a whole other matter.
I know that you're a philosopher and not a campaign strategist or advisor, but spell out for us a little bit what the implications of this really rich conversation are for how we should do politics, whether that is, some politicians and political candidates and so on who I know listen to this podcast, or whether that's us as private citizens arguing for a position. If you're in a political system where you want to defend these basic principles of liberalism against politicians who disdain them, who are trying to attack them, and so on. Does all of this have implications for the kind of language you should use, for the way in which you talk to your fellow citizens? What concretely does this mean in the heat of political battle?
So I think it does, but you were right to point out that I'm not a political strategist, and a lot will depend here on the kind of stuff that political strategists are at least supposed to be experts on, right? So I think that if a leader or an aspiring leader speaks honestly, they should say things like, here's what I'm committed to. I am committed to a very strong kind of gender equality, of the kind that is often compromised by some hyper-conservative communities. And so I'm committed to doing whatever is feasible in terms of other important values, including, by the way, the autonomy of members of that community, to protect girls and women from the from the attitudes to gender in that community. However, I should also note that politics is hard, and that it's going to be, we're going to need to find the power, the political will, the resources to do these things and to do other things. We're going to have to balance this with other considerations. We're going to have to build political alliances, including with some people who don't agree with us on everything. And what I can actually get you, the voter, the liberal voter who agrees with me, from this package will strongly depend on these things. But even if I can't deliver on this, even if at some point it becomes politically unwise to pursue these things, it doesn't make me lose. I still keep my eye on the liberal ball, namely these liberal fundamentals. And similarly for race. And similarly, I would say for socioeconomic topics, although, of course, what exactly follows from the liberal fundamentals to these economic considerations is extremely complicated, and I'm not an expert on that either. So I think that this kind of attitude for political leaders may actually be useful politically. But I may be wrong about this. This is really a question for political strategists. Even if that's so, I think it could be a useful, thinking in those ways could be useful for political leaders, say, within some circles, even if that's not the best message to splash on billboards. Right?
So you're not just a very distinguished moral philosopher, you also happen to be a citizen of the State of Israel. And I know that you've been thinking very carefully over the course of the last years, both about what the world's reaction to the terrible massacre by Hamas has missed, and about the moral constraints on how a government can legitimately respond to those kind of attacks. How do you see the current situation, and to what extent do you share the widespread moral concerns about Israel's conduct of a war in Gaza?
I've shared some concerns since October 8th, although I thought that the initial, certainly some initial powerful, ruthless response was called for. But for many, many months now, at least since March of 2024, I believe that at least most of the military activity by Israel in Gaza cannot be justified. I don't know if genocide is precisely the right word. I also don't care whether genocide is precisely the right word. I think that it's very clear that many of Israel's actions have been, at the very least, indifferent to the fate of many innocents in Gaza. I think that certainly proportionality, to the extent that we can understand what it's about, has been violated. And I also think, again, for over a year now, that it's very clear that at least some main considerations that guide the decision-making on the Israeli side have nothing to do with the kind of morally acceptable considerations that could possibly justify also the death of some innocents as collateral damage or whatever. So I think that given this, given all of this, I of course cannot defend. In fact, I've been criticizing the Israeli involvement in Gaza. I do want to mention a few other things. First, I don't think that these things are simple. Some things are. I mean, there have been, from the get-go, some genocidal statements by Israeli leaders. You don't have to know much more about the facts in order to morally condemn those. We know at least about some of Israel's practices in Gaza that they're just indefensible in any way, and that's it. But about many others, it's not clear. I've emphasized several times in the past the significance of deterrence considerations. I was really disappointed to find out that almost there's hardly anything about the moral relevance of deterrence in the just war theory kind of literature. I think some people are. There've been something about nuclear deterrence and so on, but this was mostly game theoretical and was very different. So I think some people are working on this now. I hope that they'll come up with more reasonable things. I thought that some of the criticisms of Israel were clearly unjustified from early on. This continued later on. It's not a very good context for nuances in the political discussion, is it? But it's a very good place where nuances are needed. So, for instance, people who were rightly critical of many of Israel's practices in Gaza sort of immediately carried over this kind of criticism also to Israel's war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, where I think the situation is very different and Israel's actions were by and large much more defensible. So things are complicated here. But the situation that we have now is a morally corrupt Israeli government that has been making decisions based on irrelevant and so impermissible considerations for many, many months now, in ways that, of course, many innocents in Gaza pay the price for, but also Israeli hostages, Israeli soldiers, and others as well. So I'm certainly, I of course, won't defend the Israeli government for that.
So let's go back to the immediate aftermath of the Hamas massacre. At that point, what do you think would have been justified? Presumably, at the very least, action to try and free and return the hostages that had been taken. Presumably, whatever was needed to avert a repeat of a similar security threat to Israel, and you implied that some form of deterrence to stop other entities from attacking Israel in similar or different ways. Sort of talk us through sort of what you think after that moment was justified, and then we can get perhaps later in the conversation to when and how Israel went beyond those justifiable actions.
Right. So yes, releasing hostages is of course justified if feasible, but I'm not a military expert. From what I understand, it wasn't really feasible from the get-go, and you can see that the number of, Israel has apparently some very, very well-trained commando units, and yet the number of actions that were really helpful in releasing hostages is minuscule. So once again, the kind of pragmatism plays a role here, right? Yes, in principle, of course, you can use force in order to release hostages, but if it's not feasible, then that's not justified either. Of course, preventive measures about future attacks by Hamas, those are of course easily justified. But yes, I think that deterrence is extremely important, but also extremely tricky, partly because it's so easily abusable, and it gets really dangerously close to, say, inflicting harm on innocents as a means to an end, which is the sort of paradigmatic moral wrong involved in warfare. But I do think that let's imagine a situation in which Israel responds in an extremely measured way. I think that sends a message to many of the both to Hamas operatives, but much more generally. So the game of deterrence, one of the things that makes it complicated is you don't play deterrence against a single player. You play deterrence against the field, because everyone is watching. Right? And so I think that an extremely measured response would have been devastating in terms of deterrence. It's really important to understand that deterrence saves lives. Like many lives all the time. You have, independently of the interests of Israel or of a specific party to a specific conflict. Of course, you want deterrence to play a role, and the way to maintain deterrence is always using blood, and in fact, the blood of innocents. There is no other way. And I think that there are strong, strict moral constraints on how one is allowed to sort of maintain, perhaps rehabilitate deterrence. And we can talk about those if you want, but to just ignore deterrence as if nothing about deterrence can justify the use of force, including in ways that involve collateral damage to innocents, is, I think, extremely simple-minded and morally counterproductive, because because no military leader or political leader in their right mind will ignore deterrence. So if you offer what it purports to be the best version of moral considerations applying to warfare while ignoring deterrence, then you've just made it fully clear and obvious that no one's ever going to listen to you. No one with actual power is ever going to listen to you. And second, because deterrence saves so many lives. It's worth thinking about its value, despite also being extremely dangerous and open to abuse.
Yeah, I mean, and the importance of deterrence is intuitive when we go back to the individual level and the level of criminal justice, right? Obviously, one of the reasons why we feel that we need swift and effective punishment of people who break the law is that the best way to make sure that there isn't a lot of law breaking is for people to expect negative consequences for when they break the law. And it's not hard to see, at least at that level, how if you don't impose deterrence, if this, by the way, one of the problems with the criminal justice system in the United States, that the murder clearance rate is only about 50%, I believe nationally and certainly in many places, you end up with more violence. Now, as you're also pointing out, deterrence, it is so hard to lay out what form of action will establish effective deterrence and what is needed to establish deterrence, that it can then become this kind of catch-all argument to justify anything that would otherwise be unjustifiable, and say, well, this might look like disproportionate force, that might do like an unreasonable action, but that's what's needed for deterrence, and so it becomes a kind of free-floating argument that can potentially justify anything. So it's very interesting, I think, to point out that there is a gap in the literature here that hopefully will be filled. So, in concrete steps, what was you think required to establish those goals of freeing as many hostages as possible, or trying to induce Hamas to do that, of gaining enough control over the territory, or at least of disabling enough of the military infrastructure, including rocket launchers and tunnels and so on, to disable Hamas's ability to attack Israel, and perhaps to establish that deterrence that could then prevent future violence. What was needed to do that, and at what point did you feel that those goals had been, to the extent possible, reached?
So I think that a ruthless response was crucial. I think that a willingness to pay a price in collateral damage was crucial. In fact, I think that perhaps even a greater willingness to pay a price in collateral damage than in past scenarios was crucial. But that doesn't mean that a limitless willingness to cause such tragic consequences was defensible. It was not. And also, we should talk about proportionality. The annoying things, though, is that, proportionality is one of the most important things, but also the hardest thing to say anything intelligent about, certainly in general, right? I don't know of any interesting philosophical account of what proportionality comes to exactly here, right? So I don't have the kind of concrete terms that you would run, and I certainly don't have the kind of terms that would be needed to say, this specific kind of bombing in this specific area was justified and this was not. For this, you would not need this nicely, I guess, corresponds with the earlier parts of our conversation. You would need much more by way of empirical knowledge that I don't have, and that I don't know if anyone does. But we can always at least talk about the kinds of considerations that are and that are not relevant. So there have been some people within the Israeli government who have spoken from the very morning of October 7th, perhaps partly because these have been their wishes even before October 7th. They have talked really about ethnic cleansing in Gaza. And there is also this thing that has been extremely common in Israeli public discourse. People saying things like, there are no innocents in Gaza. Right? Okay. Well, that's genocidal. That cannot be defended in any way. And if a leader says such things, then they cannot be trusted to actually, way before we get to the really problematic proportionality calculus, we already know that they cannot be trusted with decision making. Furthermore, there is this important distinction between targeting an innocent and merely tolerating the harm to innocent as collateral damage, as a foreseen side effect of targeting a legitimate target. But all of that presupposes that the use of force by and large is justified. But if you have very high-ranking military officers, in fact, almost consensually saying from very early on that there are no more feasible military goals that can be achieved, and if you further have a very strong reason to suspect, as we've just seen in more detail in the very recent New York Times story about how Netanyahu made decisions, how Prime Minister Netanyahu made decisions throughout, if you have very strong reason to suspect that really what drives him is not anything about protecting innocents on either side of the border, but rather things about maintaining the support of the most extreme right-wing parts, also most morally corrupt parts of his coalition government, then you know enough in order to object to that. And I think that we have known that. Anyone who with their eyes open, we have known that since quite early on. Not since October. We've had some suspicion, I've written about it on the first week of the war, that there have been some genocidal statements that should be taken very carefully, should be taken very seriously. But again, things were complicated. There were also legitimate aims for the war. But since something like March of 24, I think that it's been very clear that the main guiding considerations in Israeli leadership are of precisely wrong kind, so that not a single child's collateral damage can be justified, because that's not why the war is continuously being fought.
Two things I have found to be confusing watching this from afar, and they're empirical things, but I'd like to get your moral judgment on this. The first is just that I'm surprised by how difficult it seems to be to get an effective control over Hamas's tunnel system. I understand that it's extremely extensive. I understand that obviously there's often civilian infrastructure above these tunnels, but I find it hard to understand why it is so difficult to disable them for military use over such an extended period of time. The other is that it's hard for me to understand why it has been so hard to get Hamas out of the territory. And by that I don't mean sort of every person who has some kind of affiliation with Hamas, everybody who in some ways has been a Hamas fighter, but to ensure that Hamas does not have effective control over the territory. And I'm mentioning those two things because when I talk to people who are trying to defend the conduct of the ongoing war, those are the two things that I think we're most likely to point to. That, of course, Israel needs to disable the tunnel system which has allowed those attacks to happen and which pose an ongoing danger to Israel. And that, of course, it is intolerable to live next to Hamas-controlled territory after that organization planned and carried out these terrible attacks. And if we're right about those two arguments, then that might provide some kind of rationale for the continuation of the war. So, explain to me, in your judgment, are the tunnels basically disabled? Is Hamas basically defanged? Or does Israel have to live with a functional tunnel system, with the Gaza Strip effectively being under the control of Hamas? How are you thinking about those two arguments?
To say that I'm not an expert on this will be an understatement. I suspect that the answers are very murky in both cases. That is, a lot of the tunnel system has been neutralized, but some of it remains. And also a lot of much of Hamas's hold on the territory has been undermined, had been undermined long ago. But, of course, some of this remains. There's a good question about, what can be done about this. There are some suggestions on the table. Again, people who are not exactly strong left-wingers, who are experts on the more military side, think that some of these suggestions actually make sense. And we know for a fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been rejecting them consistently, at least since April 24, for ulterior motives, for political reasons. But once again, I don't think that these things are simple. And when you're trying to understand what's going on, here's another complexity that I find it hard to tolerate, the indifference to these complexities in much of public discourse. So many people will say on the Israeli side that the IDF, the Israeli military, has been extremely trying to avoid harm to innocents. Some people in Israel, by the way, will say that it hasn't, and that it's a good thing that it hasn't. Right? So there are different views. And many people criticizing Israel will say something like that Israel has shown at the very least indifference to the lives of Palestinian innocents, and maybe even worse than that. But of course, the reality is complicated. It depends on, in some parts of this huge and hugely messy war, some units in the IDF have shown admirable sensitivity to not unnecessarily hurting innocent lives. And in others, we have just blood-boiling reports about people who are just eager to cause as much harm as possible and to want to drive people out. And all of this is a part of the phenomenon. For all I know, all of this is a part of every large-scale military in the history of mankind. But it's certainly a part of what we're seeing here, and October 7th did not help. And so you could foresee a lot of that, because on top of genuine kind of motivations that are part of every war and that are part of racism and so on, there's also the feeling of strong fear, justified fear, following October 7th, and also unjustified but understandable feeling of revenge and so on. Right? So if you're asking me, are you saying that all Israeli soldiers are war criminals? Of course not. If you're saying, well, are you saying that everything that Israel does is okay? Then of course not. But even just this by way of nuances is already fairly hard to get away with. I mean, I think that some people outside of Israel think of me as an Israel apologist, and some people in Israel think of me as a traitor. What can one do?
Well, this is certainly a topic on which it's easy to inspire enmity on both sides.
Yes, I've been very successful at that.
Congratulations. It must mean, as they sometimes say, that you're doing something right. What do you think is the appropriate response to those moral facts as you outline them by Israeli citizens, by countries that have historically been allies of Israel, by rank-and-file citizens of Western democracies like the United States or Britain or Germany? What should people do in order to fight against what you believe to be genuine injustices committed at the moment by the Israeli state? And what steps do you think are either counterproductive or go beyond what an appropriate response to those moral facts would be?
So within Israel, of course, protests are important. It's heartbreaking to say that while we have seen consistent protests almost throughout these awful times against the government, including its failure to return hostages, there have been very little by way of protests about, say, the fate of innocents in Gaza. There has been some, but the numbers are fairly small. I also think that Israelis, at least more and more Israelis, should refuse to take part in the war. This is always a tough decision for personal reasons, but also for moral reasons, because many people feel committed to the people they serve with. Many people feel the onus of some of the military missions that are still justifiable, and there are those as well, right? So that's hard, but I do think that is an important point now, and it has been for a while. And I think that people should also, certainly in Israel, fight some of the underlying things going on, like, for instance, the occupation and its many different forms and the wrongs that partly constitute it. Outside of Israel, so I think that the kind of protests we've been seeing are by and large legitimate, but there are problems, right? So, for instance, immediately, it's not even in the aftermath of October, so on October 7th, we already saw some people, including some who unbelievably think of themselves as on the left, who refused to even condemn what we saw from Hamas on October 7th. So once again, if someone is refusing to condemn that kind of stuff, the conversation is over. and I'm not willing to listen to whatever else they have to say, even if it ends up being true. I'll hear it from someone else. Some people didn't quite say that, but give a similar kind of feeling, right? So if you are just condemning Israel, but have nothing to say about Hamas, both internal and external tactics and strategies and policies, then I don't know that this means you're an anti-Semite, but I have some suspicions. Or anyway, you're not being very morally fair or politically wise. So it's important it's not about balance, because there is no balance, and I don't care about balance either, but it is important not to be biased, right? And that it's always important. It's important in this case too. I do think that external pressure is really important. I actually thought, I wrote about it. I tried to convince American Jews about the importance in external pressure on Israel when it comes to the occupation long before October 7th. I thought that October 7th changed it a little bit for a short period of time, but that we're back there. I think you may have alluded to boycotting, by and large boycotting BDS, whatever kind of measures. And I'm a bit torn about those. So unlike some of my colleagues, I don't think that an academic boycott is just beyond the pale. I think that it should be one of the cards that a good external pressure kind of system should be willing to play at some point. But I do think that it's a price. You don't want to just do it unless it's actually conducive to bringing about good results. And I think that, so for purely instrumental reasons, I can't see that it can be justified now, unless it's a part of a much more structured, much better thought out system of external pressures that will include some economic measures and some perhaps having to do with weapon supply and with other things too. And then I'm okay with academia being a part of it. So I don't think academia should be singled out in either direction. So I don't think that, as long as there is no more serious attempt to actually bring Israel to the right solutions, I don't think that there's any point in paying the price of a serious academic boycott. On the other hand, if it is a part of a feasible, possibly successful kind of system, then I don't think that academia is somehow holy and should be singled out not to be boycotted.
How do you think about one of the arguments that people often make, which is kind of comparative, where they're saying, look, why is it that of all of the injustices in the world, of all of the wars in the world, there's a single-minded focus on Israel? Because I'm a little bit torn about that argument, right? On the one hand, I think that, better to be, focused on some injustice than no injustice at all. And there are obvious ways in which Israel is a close ally to other Western nations, which make the citizens of those Western nations feel that they are more morally involved in things involving Israel. At the same time, there are also arguments where I start to feel queasy in the same way. I mean, why is it that people feel terribly about the suffering of Muslims in Gaza or other parts of the region, but not at all in China or elsewhere? That's a little bit strange, right? Why is it that people discover the supposed principle that there should be no ethno-state, but they have no apparent problem with the existence of Pakistan or lots of other places that are premised on a ethno-religious identity, and often, by the way, have become purely populated by those ethno-religious groups by expelling a lot of Jews in the past. So how do we sort of balance what I understand is the instinct of many of my friends and acquaintances to say, why are you singling out Israel in this way? Doesn't this show some form of bias? With the fact that there may be some legitimate reasons for citizens of Western democracies to be focused more on Israel than in other places, and with the fact that doesn't somehow make the underlying moral facts vanish. I mean, perhaps philosophers love to pose dilemmas where they say, you have to jump one way or the other. Perhaps the right way to jump is to care just as much about Benjamin Netanyahu's conduct of the war in Gaza as we do, and also care a lot more about what's going on in Sudan and lots of other places around the world.
Right. So I think I agree with the kind of tension that you mentioned here, but I want to introduce a distinction when it comes to what's at issue, right? If the issue is the decency and consistency of several critics of Israel, then I'm very worried. If the issue is the lives of innocents in Gaza and whether they've factored in the right kind of way to considerations of decision makers in Israel, then the mere fact that some of the people criticizing Israel have been less than fully decent, less than fully consistent, and somewhat biased, is just neither here nor there, right? And I hope you will forgive me if I'm much more concerned about the latter than about the former. So I do think that it does show some bias of some people, and if you're trying to then worry what explains this bias, you may find out some disturbing facts about these people. But that doesn't mean that indifference to the lives of innocents can be justified at all, right? And also, and this is an important point, so some people say, justice everywhere is a condition for justice anywhere. I'm not sure I buy that. But here's something I really don't buy, and that's roughly the claim that in order to fight injustice anywhere, you have to fight injustice everywhere. That kind of creed is a sure way of making the case that no one fights against any injustice anywhere, right? So the mere fact that similar fights can be fought, should be fought, are fought by some, but not by everyone elsewhere, falls far short of vindicating the wrongs that Israel is responsible for in Gaza, and doesn't even mean that these fights shouldn't be fought to sort of bring those wrongs to an end. And yes, there are other things too that we should be worried about.
David, Enoch, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and thanks so much for this extra part of the conversation.
Thanks for having me, Yascha. Thank you.